right, hey everyone. So what we're looking at for today's lecture is the Articles of Confederation. Um, this was the first government that the newly founded United States created in the wake of the American Revolution. So after kicking the English off the continent by winning the Revolutionary War, the founders were left with the idea of now what kind of government do we want to create? So this is the first one they tried that began in 1781. All right, so after getting rid of the British colonial rule, the founders and the colonists were left with the idea of what kind of government they want to create. So the idea is, what would it look like to have no government? What would happen if there was no government? What would happen during those crisis moments when everything crashed in around you? Who would you fall back on? What would you go? Where would you go for help? So we can see some examples of this in our own country with some natural disasters. And Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and Louisiana in 2005. It shut off and flooded most of the city of New Orleans. People were left there without power, without a government, without any system. They were left basically in a state of anarchy for several days before the federal government, before FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, was able to come in and help them. And so what you saw was looting, people stealing things, people dying in the streets. There was no one to help them. So when tornadoes hit Joplin, Missouri in 2012, who was there to help them? You could see the devastation around them, but you see the police car there. The government is what's usually expected to come in and help these people. So think about the idea, if they didn't have government, they'd be left in a state of just chaos like this. No, without a government, who responds? Who helps the people? Who cleans up after September 11th, 2001? The mayhem that happened around the Twin Towers and at the Pentagon. I mean, what really happens if there is no government there? You know, how, where do people go? What do they do? How are they helped? So without a central government, without a government, who would control the borders? Would there even be a country? I mean, would people just come and go? So you see a border patrol agent, and this is a hot topic, a hot button issue today. But the idea of, is there even a country without a government? What about poverty? What about people who are left on the streets, left without anything for them? We might not do the best at helping these people out as a government, but if there's nothing there, there's absolutely nothing to help them. There's no government to help these people. So what do we do to create a situation where people can find at least a minimum amount of help? So I'm trying to show you those kind of rhetorical questions and those thought-provoking ideas with modern issues, because that's really kind of where the newly founded country was in the period that historians call the critical period between 1781 and 1789. The United States was a newly found country without a central government. They were a collection of states, a federation of states, but they didn't have a central government that could respond to disasters, couldn't respond to crises like we've seen in modern times. So it was a really period where, the analogy of a sinking ship, they had gained their freedom, but they really didn't have the organization and the government to support that ship. So the main reason the colonies did not create a centralized government was they had a fear of a centralized government. They had fought a revolutionary war for 5 years after the Declaration of Independence to get rid of a king, to get rid of a tyrant in King George. British laws and taxes made Americans fear centralized government. They were afraid of the situation that happened if they just trade one tyrant for another in a central government. So having overthrown a tyrant, as they saw it in King George, the idea was to try to create a limited government, a government with a lot of restraints, a very small government. And there were certain influences for this idea. George Mason had written the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which is very similar to ideas in the Declaration of Independence. But this is a document that was drafted in 1776, and it proclaimed the inherent rights of men, including the right to reform or abolish inadequate government. And this would become kind of an influential idea, and it kind of echoes those rights, echoes those ideas seen in the Declaration of Independence. The consent of the governed, and also the idea of natural rights. There also was the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1777, was actually passed by the Virginia General Assembly in 1786. And this is a statement of both freedom of conscience and the principle of separation of church and state. So basically, it was an idea in Virginia that people could practice whatever religious belief they wanted to, and there would be no state mandated religion. So this would later be the forerunner for the First Amendment protections of separation of church and state, freedom of religion. So really what these two documents did was strip down the power of those state governors in Virginia. So this kind of created the idea of what they would do. They wanted to take power away from the government rather than give the government more power. So the emphasis on natural rights and on freedom actually spread not just from those wealthy landowning white men, but there was an idea of leveling of classes, not having that landed nobles, those cavaliers, that people could now be more equal, that all men are created equal, but that doesn't mean just white men. So women briefly gained the right to vote in New Jersey. This was stripped away, but an abolitionist societies formed in Pennsylvania. Abolitionists were promoting the idea of freeing the slaves, of ending the institution of slavery. Societies began to form to create the African American slaves should be seen as equal, should not be held as slaves. So the first government created by the new country was what was known as the Articles of Confederation. This was the first national government. It was a loose grouping of states. So you had 13 original colonies become states, and each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence in every power, jurisdiction, and right. So basically only a very limited amount of power was given to a national government. It was basically going to be a loose federation of states, kind of similar to what you see today in the European Union, where they get together and they cooperate over certain things, but there's very limited power overall. So it really focused on state power. Each state had one vote in the Congress, and states could veto laws. So if one state did not want to pass a law, they could effectively veto the will of 12 others. So you have to think about how difficult it must have been to get anything done, because imagine getting 13 people together to get along on anything. Think about getting 13 states full of citizens together to vote on anything. So it's really hard to get anything done with that. All states have to agree on something. And it created a very weak national government. There was no executive or judicial branches. There was only a legislative branch that could pass laws, of course, with all the states' approval. They had no ability to tax or to regulate commerce. And of course, states are working between each other. There's interstate commerce, so there's no way of regulating that. Each state's making its own laws, and there was no common currency. So different states had different money, so it made it very hard to trade and to have business between states. So there was no president, no executive branch, or a Supreme Court, no judicial branch. So you have to think about that as how little would get done, how little authority they would have. There's no executive. So pretty much everything we think about with government today usually is tied to things done by the executive branch, military power, police power, things done within the country, or with the judicial branch, our court system, our national court system. So very little was able to get done. So there was no national tax. There was no federal tax like we have today, or laws on business. So there were no laws that regulated interstate commerce, commerce between different states, or how states could deal with international trade, stuff like that. So what would happen if the government did not have any money to spend? So you have to think that there's a federal government, there's no funding for it. No, they're not bringing any money in. So today it's hard to imagine because we know how much money the federal government has, but the Articles of Confederation were set up to where they couldn't even collect taxes. Pretty much the only success that the Confederation government had was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And this is a charter that provided a government for the Northwest Territories that admitted these Northwest Territories as Ohio territories in this area you see now as part of the Union. And this basically provided a method for admitting new states to the Union and guaranteed certain rights for these territories. They would later become states after the Articles of Confederation, but they are territories of the Confederation government at this point. And what this shows is that where the British had drawn the line in these territories, that now the new American country is going to continue to expand westward, and there is a process for adding territory, a process for incorporating new states into the Union. So one of the big problems with the Articles of Confederation is the problem of not having a single currency, not having a money that can be used throughout the states. There were 7 different currencies throughout the 13 different states. And in 1775, the Continental Congress had actually issued what was known as the Continental Currency or Continentals as a paper money the coin money that could be used throughout the colonies, during the war, during things. But there was after the Articles of Confederation were passed, the that dollar devalued by 98%. So it only had 2% of its original value, and that ended up causing debt for the national government, a debt of $160 million, which is huge if you think about that in today's money. So the government's already getting a huge debt because they don't have any control of the currency. They can't raise money. So it's a mess. So one of the problems of having such a weak national government is that other countries did not respect the newly formed United States. They didn't expect their authority because they knew they didn't have an army. They didn't have the ability to really fight back against other countries' authority. So what happens is in 1784, Spain closes the port of New Orleans, the city of New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi, to American trade. And what Spain is trying to do here is actually draw those Western territories, those territories created west of the Appalachians that have people, have settlers in them. They're basically trying to draw them to the Spanish Empire. So these states, the states that would come like Kentucky, Tennessee, other states couldn't trade over the Appalachian Mountains. There are no roads like we have today. You can't trade goods with those other states. So they relied on the Mississippi, and when it was closed down to American trade, that makes it very tempting for them to kind of not declare allegiance to the Confederation, but to the Spanish Empire. So Spain is actually just kind of testing the will of the new nation. So it wasn't only other nations that knew that the United States were weak. It was also pirates. So the Barbary pirates are groups of pirates that come from North Africa, from kind of the modern countries of Algeria, Tunisia, Libya. So they had typically operated pirated in the Mediterranean, but they had so little respect for the government. They knew that there was really no American Navy. There was nowhere for the American country to fight back, that they were boldly attacking American merchant marine ships throughout the Atlantic. They were holding the crew and cargo hostage and often getting the American government to pay a ransom. So they were very bold and blatant in this. They like, you can't stop us. You have no way of stopping us from stealing your goods, getting these goods back. To get your people back, you have to pay for them. So it's really affecting trade throughout the states. They're getting pirated all the time. So the British Navy also did not have any respect for the newly formed country. They were testing the same authority and finding that there was no authority, much like the pirates. What the British Navy would do is capture American vessels and kidnap sailors and put them in the British Navy, basically kidnap them and force them to be part of the British Navy. There's a term for this, it's known as impressment. They would take them and basically hold them hostage against their will. So the British are stopping ships and taking Americans into their navy, basically blatantly with the knowledge of the newly formed Confederation. There's nothing they could do about it. So even following the loss at Yorktown and the end of the Revolutionary War, the British kept forts in the Ohio Territory. They were not threatened by the idea of the newly formed government. There wasn't a national army. They couldn't attack them, so the Americans couldn't force them out of there. These newly Northwest Territories that were adopted, they didn't have militias that could go up against these British forts, so the British simply kept their forts in Ohio. But the real disaster that broke the Articles of Confederation, broke the Confederation government, was Shays' Rebellion, which was an uprising in western Massachusetts led by common farmers, by those militiamen against the government. And so this really forced a change going forward. What happened in Shays' Rebellion is, of course, the revolution ends. All these people fought, they've raised these militias, they've had a continental army, but the vast majority of soldiers were left penniless. The government was unable to pay them. So these soldiers are wondering, what do we do now? We fought for this newly found country, but what comes next? So there's a lot of economic distress. The nation was struggling financially. They had that massive debt from the war and from also the inability to raise money. And trade was collapsing. They weren't generating revenue through trade to be able to take care of these soldiers. So during the war, Congress had failed to pay soldiers really a salary through much of the war. They basically fought on the promise that Congress would give them half their salary for the rest of their lives as a pension, so they would continue to receive government money for fighting for the newly found government. But they actually only received 1 month of cash following the revolution. So they were basically the promise from the national government, from Congress, had been broken. They did not receive any money. They fought and they weren't given anything in return. So a lot of these soldiers, a lot of these people who had fought for independence felt deceived, felt taken advantage of by the government. Thomas Foster was one of them. He went back to his home in Massachusetts following the Revolutionary War and didn't receive any payment. So he was quoted saying, "They sent us into the country naked and destitute of money. The country has most shamefully deceived them. They have not paid them. They told them they were going to do something and they didn't do it." So these are people who are upset, and tensions begin to build in Massachusetts. Massachusetts raised taxes in order to pay off its debts. The states have the ability to tax; it's just not the national government. But Massachusetts is trying to pay off debts. It has, and so many farmers went bankrupt and lost their home from the rise in taxes. This is kind of seeing as exactly as what happened with the British. So the raising of taxes and the seizure of farms really upsets people in Western Massachusetts. Most of these people are farmers. A lot of people had fought for the revolution, had fought for the right against taxation without representation, to have fought against the idea of a lot of these taxes. So a group of them, led by Daniel Shays, who was a Revolutionary War veteran, in 1787, marched to Springfield, Massachusetts in protest of this. They're saying that our rights are not being represented. You are taxing us, taking our farms. So Shays led 1,400 men to Springfield. They stopped the court from meeting. The court was confiscating the property. So this is the court that was actually taking the property from them. So they stopped them from actually meeting. So the idea is to stop them from taking the property. And then Shays led his men to the arsenal to arm themselves. So, what ensued is what's known as the Battle in Springfield. As Shays' rebellion and Shays' men marched on the armory, they were met by a militia, a group of men that were actually a private army. They were mercenaries. They were paid for by merchants and wealthy landowners to protect peace, because they wanted to protect their way of life. So the state of Massachusetts had no ability to raise a militia, or to have an army. The national government did not have an army it could defend it. So basically, private citizens are having to pay for their own army to defend order. So as Shay's men crossed here, you can see them crossing a snow-covered field towards the armory against that private militia, that defense force. The defense force fired upon Shay's men. They fired their cannon, which was loaded with grape shot, which is just basically small pieces of metal, almost like a shotgun full of cannon, and it sprayed into the crowd. It killed about 3 or 4 of the men, wounding 12 of them. And the force, the rebellion, these people quickly dispersed. They did not take the armory. They were forced away. So the rebellion died down after being dispersed in Springfield, and Shays and his men were allowed to pledge an oath of allegiance to the Massachusetts government, to the Confederation, in exchange for becoming members of society again, basically saying, like, we will follow the rules now. But what this really shows is that the government does not have control. They are unable to control its citizenry, but also the feeling among the citizens is that these are members of society. These are landowners. These are farmers that are raising up in arms against the government, much like they had against the British. People are feeling, such as Daniel Shays, are feeling that the Articles of Confederation and that the states' governments were abusing them in the same ways that the British government had, and that they had raised up in arms against the British government. So they felt that they had a right to do this. They saw the same things happening again. So the government really is not working. So really the leaders, some of the founders of the people who had signed the Declaration of Independence, who had formed this new government, began to be worried about the prospect of democracy. Elbridge Gerry, who would serve as vice president under President James Madison, um, is quoted as saying the evils we experience flow in the excess of democracy. So he's really doubting the idea of government for the people, by the people, being able to be ruled. The whims of government to basically give the people the right, and they have a rebellion. George Washington also is quoted as, "I am mortified beyond expression. We are incapable of governing ourselves." So the institution, these values they fought for, seem to be falling apart, and the founders are, expressing that. So it's becoming clear to a lot of these leaders throughout the colonies that this government is not working. So what happens is, as part of the Articles of Confederation, they meet in Philadelphia, every once in a while to discuss economic matters, discuss matters of the colonies, discuss matters of government. So delegates from the colonies meet in Philadelphia in May of 1787. And at this convention, they decide to form a new government, to throw out the Articles of Confederation and form a government known as the United States Constitution, the Constitution that we know today. So they get together and basically say, this is not working. We're going to form a new one. And that's what comes out of it, is the Constitution. These are the words they write at a convention in 1787 to begin this new government. It's that we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty, establish the Constitution for the United States of America. So you can see in these words aspects of the Articles of Confederation that did not work. Domestic tranquility, common defense, general welfare. These were not provided by the federal government, by the national government under the Articles of Confederation. So what they're setting out to do is make a new system under this Constitution that will fix those problems. In our next lecture, we'll deal directly on what they wrote in the Constitution.